"If you somehow win this case," the judge sneered, loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear, "I will resign from this bench that very day." 16-year-old Ruby Hayes did not flinch. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "I'm prepared to proceed." 3 months earlier, her father had died with this case unfinished. Everyone expected the widow's daughter to give up quietly. But Ruby had spent her whole life sitting beside her father, learning every word of the law he practiced. What the judge did not know was that Ruby already held the one piece of proof that could end Jacob Dalton's lies forever, if she could keep her only witness alive long enough to speak it. If this story moves you, take a moment to comment and let me know where in the world you are watching from tonight. And if you have not yet subscribed, now is the perfect time, because what Ruby Hayes did in a small Millbrook courtroom is a story worth staying for until the very last word. Let's step into that quiet, grieving house and the 16-year-old girl who was about to become the last hope her family had left. The Hayes house sat just outside Millbrook, modest and well-kept, though something about it had changed in the 3 months since Thomas Hayes passed, something the neighbors could sense even if they could not quite name it. Eleanor Hayes moved through her days the way a person moves through a room they have walked through 1,000 times, except now the furniture felt slightly wrong, slightly rearranged by grief. She sat by the window most evenings with mending in her lap, needle pausing mid-stitch as her mind wandered somewhere she could not always follow back from. More than once, she had set 3 plates at the supper table out of pure habit before catching herself, staring at the 3rd plate for a long, quiet moment before quietly putting it away again. Ruby noticed these small slips every time, and every time, she said nothing, because some griefs are better witnessed in silence than spoken about out loud. The house was quiet now, in a way it had never been while Thomas was alive, his booming laugh and endless stream of legal chatter replaced by the soft creak of floorboards and the occasional crackle of the fire. Ruby Hayes had never known a childhood like other girls in Millbrook. While other children played with dolls and jump ropes, Ruby had spent her earliest years curled beneath her father's heavy oak desk, sorting through scraps of discarded paper, while Thomas worked late into the evening on cases most of the town barely understood. She grew up hearing words like deed and testimony and jurisdiction the way other children heard nursery rhymes, absorbing rhythm and meaning long before she ever needed to use any of it herself. She remembered clearly, even now, a moment from when she was perhaps 7 years old, tugging on her father's sleeve and asking him plainly what a boundary marker was. Thomas had set down his pen, looked at her with the same seriousness he gave to grown clients, and explained patiently that a boundary marker was simply a promise placed into the earth itself, a line that told 2 neighbors where one man's care for the land ended and another man's began. He never once talked down to her, not that day and not any day after, and Ruby had carried that habit of taking her seriously like a small steady flame ever since, one that had not gone out even after he did. That fragile quiet was broken on an otherwise ordinary afternoon by the arrival of a formal letter, delivered by the county clerk himself, which told Eleanor plainly that Jacob Dalton intended to move forward with his long-standing claim on the water source running along the edge of Hayes land. The letter explained, in cold and proper language, that without legal representation appearing on the family's behalf within the month, the county would be forced to rule in Dalton's favor by default, regardless of the merits either side might have argued. Eleanor read the letter twice at the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly by the second reading, before setting it down and staring at nothing in particular for a long while. Ruby picked the letter up once her mother had gone quiet, reading it herself, feeling something cold and heavy settle into her stomach as she understood exactly what was being asked of them, and exactly how little time remained to answer it. The next morning, Ruby put on her best dress and walked into Millbrook determined to find someone willing to finish what her father had started. She visited Mr. Caldwell first, a lawyer her father had once called a decent, careful man, only to be met with gentle apologies and a long explanation about how busy his current caseload had become. She visited young Mr. Pierce next, freshly arrived in town and eager to build a reputation, only to watch his enthusiasm fade the moment she mentioned Jacob Dalton's name, his polite smile tightening into something more cautious and evasive. Neither man was cruel about it, and neither man was entirely wrong to be afraid, since Dalton's money and influence stretched through half the county in ways that made careers rise or quietly disappear depending on which side a man chose to stand on. But kindness wrapped around a refusal was still a refusal, and Ruby walked home that afternoon with the same letter still folded in her pocket, and no one left in Millbrook willing to carry it for her. That night, After her mother had finally gone to bed, Ruby sat alone at her father's old desk for the first time since his passing, running her fingers slowly across the worn wood before finally opening the drawer where his case files still waited, untouched, exactly as he had left them. She found the Dalton file near the bottom, thicker than she expected, filled with her father's careful handwriting, notes on old boundary agreements, dates and names she recognized from years of listening quietly nearby while he worked. She read late into the night by lamplight, piecing together the shape of a case her father had clearly believed in deeply, one built on a promise made decades ago, and now being quietly rewritten by a man with enough money to make people forget the truth. Somewhere near midnight, Ruby closed the file gently, sat back in her father's worn chair, and made a decision that had less to do with pride and everything to do with simple necessity. If no one else would stand up for her family, then she would have to learn how to stand up for them herself, starting the very next morning. The preliminary hearing was held in Millbrook's small courthouse, a modest brick building that rarely saw more than a handful of curious onlookers. But that morning, word had spread through town about the widow's daughter intending to appear in her father's place, and curiosity had filled nearly every available seat. Judge Josiah Marsh sat behind his worn wooden bench, a stern, respected man known throughout the county for running an orderly courtroom and having very little patience for anything he considered a waste of the court's valuable time. When Ruby rose from her seat and announced, in a clear and steady voice, that she would be representing her mother's interests in the matter of the disputed water rights, a ripple of murmurs moved through the gathered crowd. Elias Whitfield, seated comfortably beside Jacob Dalton at the opposing table, allowed a small, amused smile to cross his face, clearly viewing the entire proceeding as a formality standing between his client and an easy, uncontested victory. Judge Marsh studied Ruby for a long moment, his expression unreadable at first, before something closer to irritation settled into his weathered features. He reminded the room, somewhat pointedly, that this was a court of law and not a schoolroom exercise, and that serious matters deserved serious representation, not the well-meaning efforts of a grieving young girl playing at her father's profession. The room grew tense and quiet as he leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying easily across the silent courtroom, and delivered the line that would follow him for the rest of his career. If, by some miracle, Ruby Hayes managed to win this case against a man like Jacob Dalton, he told her plainly, he would resign from this very bench that same day. A few scattered laughs rose from the crowd, quickly hushed by the weight of the moment, and every eye in the room turned toward the 16-year-old girl standing alone at the front of the courtroom. Ruby did not flinch, did not look away, and did not raise her voice when she answered him. "I'm prepared to proceed," she said simply, and something about the calm certainty in those 4 words seemed to settle over the room like a held breath no one quite knew how to release. Outside the courthouse afterward, Millbrook buzzed with conversation, some voices amused and dismissive, calling it a foolish girl's stubborn pride, while others spoke more quietly, almost reluctantly impressed by the steadiness they had witnessed in a courtroom that morning. Ruby walked home alone in the cold afternoon air, her father's case file held tightly against her chest like something precious and fragile all at once, the weight of what she had just promised finally beginning to settle heavily onto her young shoulders. She had spoken with confidence inside that courtroom, but walking the long road home, doubt crept in slowly, whispering questions she had no easy answers for yet. She had made a promise in front of the entire town, in front of a judge who clearly expected her to fail, and somewhere out there, Jacob Dalton was already making plans to ensure that failure came quickly and completely. What Ruby did not yet know, walking home with her father's file clutched close against the cold, was that the true fight had not even begun, and the most dangerous moves against her had not yet been made. In the days following that tense first appearance in court, Ruby returned to her father's desk each night with a determination that surprised even her, working her way slowly and carefully through every page of the Dalton file until the true shape of the case finally became clear in her mind. Decades earlier, when the land along the creek had first been divided between 2 neighboring families, a boundary marker had been placed at a specific bend in the water, granting the Hayes side clear and lawful access to the creek that ran through it. Jacob Dalton's claim rested entirely on the argument that the marker had always stood further east, closer to the Hayes homestead, cutting the water rights onto his side of the property instead. It was, Ruby realized with growing unease, a claim that could only be disproven by someone who had actually been present decades ago, someone who remembered exactly where that original marker had stood before time, and convenient memory had blurred the truth in Dalton's favor. Buried near the back of her father's notes, in his familiar handwriting, was a single name mentioned almost in passing. Amos Fry, an old ranch hand who had worked the land back when the boundary was first agreed upon, and who Thomas Hayes had once believed might remember the truth firsthand, if only someone thought to ask him properly. Ruby found Amos Fry's small homestead on the edge of town 2 days later, a modest, weathered house with a sagging porch and a thin trail of smoke rising from its chimney into the cold afternoon air. She knocked gently, unsure what kind of welcome to expect from a stranger, and was surprised when Amos himself answered, an old man with tired eyes and a face lined deeply by decades of hard weather and harder work. Before Ruby could even properly introduce herself or explain why she had come, she noticed the sound of a child coughing weakly from somewhere inside the house, a rough, rattling sound that made her stomach tighten with concern. Amos explained, with quiet embarrassment, that his granddaughter had taken ill with fever nearly a week ago, and that the medicine needed from town cost more than his family could easily manage right now, especially with winter pressing hard against an already thin budget. Ruby did not think long before reaching into the small pouch she kept tucked inside her coat, the modest savings she had been setting aside quietly for herself over many months, and pressing it gently into Amos's rough, calloused hand. When he tried to refuse, protesting that he could not accept charity from a widow's daughter with worries enough of her own, Ruby simply told him that neighbors took care of neighbors, the same way her father always believed they should, without keeping score of who owed what to whom. It was only after the medicine had been fetched and the fever finally begun to break 2 days later that Ruby returned to ask Amos directly about the old boundary marker, half expecting him to have forgotten details buried under decades of memory. Instead, Amos sat back slowly in his chair, closed his eyes for a long moment, and began describing the exact bend in the creek where the marker had originally been placed, recalling even small details like the flat gray stone used to mark the spot and the 2 men who had shaken hands over the agreement that day. When Ruby gently asked whether he would be willing to say these same words in front of a judge, Amos hesitated only briefly before nodding, his voice steady with quiet gratitude rather than fear. He told her plainly that her family had shown his family real kindness when it cost them something to give it, and that the least he could do in return was stand up and tell the truth about a bend in a creek he remembered perfectly well, no matter how many years had passed since. Walking home that evening, Ruby felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since her father's death, a small, cautious spark of real hope that this case might not be as impossible as it had first appeared. Hope alone, however, would not teach Ruby how to properly conduct herself inside an actual courtroom, and it was for this reason that she sought out Walter Combs, her father's old clerk and longtime friend, now living a quiet, retired life on the edge of Millbrook. Walter listened to her request with visible discomfort, rubbing the back of his neck and glancing toward his own front window more than once, clearly weighing the very real risk of drawing Jacob Dalton's attention onto himself at his age. He explained, not unkindly, that men who crossed Dalton openly tended to find their lives quietly and thoroughly complicated afterward, in ways that were difficult to prove and even harder to undo. But Walter had also known Thomas Hayes for over 20 years, had respected him deeply, and found it harder than expected to turn away his old friend's daughter when she stood in his doorway asking for help. Eventually, he agreed to assist her, though only privately and unofficially, insisting that his name never appear anywhere near the case itself, a compromise Ruby accepted gratefully, understanding exactly what kind of quiet courage it still required of him. Not everyone in Millbrook showed similar discretion regarding the case, and Elias Whitfield in particular seemed to enjoy discussing it rather loudly whenever the opportunity presented itself. One afternoon at the general store, while several townsfolk gathered nearby to collect supplies, Whitfield remarked with easy amusement that he found it almost charming. A young girl armed with her father's old law books, believing she stood any real chance against a man of Jacob Dalton's standing and resources. A few people laughed along politely, though others exchanged uncertain glances, clearly less comfortable mocking a grieving widow's daughter than Whitfield seemed to be. Word of his comments reached Ruby by evening, carried gently by a sympathetic neighbor who thought she deserved to know what was being said about her around town. Rather than discouraging her, something about hearing Whitfield's casual contempt settled a quiet, steady resolve deep into Ruby's chest, a feeling less like anger and more like clarity regarding exactly what she needed to prove, and to whom. Over the following nights, Ruby and Walter worked steadily by lamplight at the Hayes kitchen table, piecing together an opening argument built carefully around the boundary agreement, Amos Fry's memory, and the plain, simple truth of what had been promised decades ago between 2 honest neighbors. Walter taught her the proper rhythms of courtroom procedure, when to speak plainly, and when to let silence do the work instead, patiently correcting her when nervousness made her words rush together too quickly. Ruby's progress came slowly and honestly, several stumbling attempts followed by small, genuine improvements, the kind of steady growth that comes from real effort rather than sudden brilliance. There were nights when frustration nearly overwhelmed her, when the weight of representing her family properly felt impossibly heavy for someone her age, and Walter would simply remind her, gently, that her father had felt exactly the same uncertainty when he first started out, long before anyone in Millbrook trusted his judgment either. Slowly, argument by argument, Ruby began to sound less like a grieving girl reciting borrowed words, and more like someone who genuinely understood the case she intended to argue. Word eventually arrived that the formal hearing had been scheduled for 2 weeks out, giving Ruby just enough time to prepare properly, and just enough time for worry to creep back in during the quiet hours between practice sessions. On the night before Walter's final visit that week, Ruby walked out to the barn alone after her mother had gone to sleep, carrying a small lantern and her father's worn opening notes tucked under one arm. She draped her father's old coat over the back of a wooden chair, the way he used to leave it after a long day, and stood facing the empty stalls as though addressing a courtroom full of silent, watching faces. She spoke her opening statement slowly and carefully into the cold night air, pausing occasionally to steady her breathing, glancing now and then toward the empty coat, as if some quiet part of her still hoped her father might somehow be listening. If you have ever had to find courage you didn't know you had, simply because no one else was left to carry the weight for you, tell us about it in the comments below, and remember, we should never judge someone until we understand exactly what they are carrying, because in 2 weeks' time, Ruby Hayes would walk back into that courtroom, and she would not be facing Jacob Dalton alone this time. She would be facing him with the truth standing quietly beside her, if only it could survive long enough to be heard. The week before the hearing began quietly enough, but small, unsettling details started gathering the way storm clouds gather before anyone thinks to look up and notice them. A neighbor mentioned to Ruby, almost in passing while she picked up supplies at the general store, that strange riders had been seen near Amos Fry's property late at night, unfamiliar men who did not belong to any ranch nearby that anyone recognized. Another comment reached her a day later, this one more troubling, when a farmer mentioned that Dalton's foreman had been asking around town about Amos, wondering aloud, in a voice meant to sound casual, whether the old man's memory was truly as sharp as people seem to think it was these days. Ruby felt a cold unease settle into her chest at these small, scattered remarks, the kind of unease that made sense only when pieced together afterward, though at the time she told herself it was simply nerves before the hearing, nothing more than her own fear finding shapes in ordinary shadows. Walter, when she mentioned it to him, grew quiet in a way that worried her more than anything he actually said aloud. 2 days before Amos was scheduled to testify, Ruby walked out to his homestead one final time, intending only to review his statement together once more before the hearing, carrying with her a small basket of bread as a simple gesture of thanks for everything his family had already risked. But as she approached the familiar sagging porch, something felt wrong immediately, a stillness in the yard that had nothing peaceful about it. The chickens usually kept near the fence were gone. No smoke rose from the chimney. When she knocked, no answer came, and when she finally pushed the door open, calling Amos's name into the empty house, she found only bare shelves, a cold hearth, and no note left behind to explain where the family had gone, or why they had left in such obvious haste. Ruby stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, her basket of bread forgotten at her side, fear rising in her chest that had nothing to do with the case anymore, and everything to do with whether an old man and his sick granddaughter were even safe. She rode straight to Walter's home afterward, breathless and pale, and together they agreed to investigate as quietly as possible, careful not to draw further attention that might make things worse for Amos wherever he had gone. It took 2 careful, quiet days of gentle questions and patient listening before a frightened neighbor finally admitted, in a hushed voice, and only after Walter promised her name would never be repeated, what she had witnessed 2 nights before Amos disappeared. 2 men working for Jacob Dalton had visited the Fry homestead after dark, she said, speaking politely enough on the surface, but leaving behind words that felt far less polite once you understood what they truly meant. They had mentioned, almost gently, how difficult it could become for an old man to find work anywhere in the county if certain people decided he was no longer trustworthy, and how illness had a cruel way of returning to a household that had only just recovered from it. Nothing had been threatened outright, nothing that could ever be written down and proven in a courtroom, but the message had clearly been understood exactly as it was intended to be. That evening, sitting across from Walter at her father's kitchen table, Ruby finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what this meant for the case itself. Without Amos standing before the court to confirm what he remembered, all she had left was her father's single handwritten page describing the original boundary agreement, a document Whitfield would almost certainly argue was unverified, possibly even forged, since no living witness remained willing to support it. Walter rubbed his tired eyes and suggested, gently and without any judgment in his voice, that perhaps it would be wiser to quietly withdraw the case now, sparing Ruby the pain of a public defeat that seemed, given the circumstances, almost certain to come. It was not a cruel suggestion, only a practical one, offered by a man who had watched enough courtroom battles to recognize when the odds had turned firmly against a losing side. Ruby sat with his words for a long moment, staring down at her father's careful handwriting on that single fragile page, feeling exhausted in a way that went far deeper than simple tiredness. Later that night, unable to sleep, Ruby found her mother still awake by the fire, and the two of them talked quietly in a way they had not managed to since Thomas's death, honest and unguarded in the dark stillness of the house. Eleanor asked her plainly whether she intended to withdraw, and Ruby, staring into the low flames, explained something she had only just fully understood herself. If she gave up now, the boundary marker would move permanently in the county's records, not just for this generation, but for every family afterward who would ever depend on that same stretch of water for their land and their livestock. This was no longer only about her father's unfinished case, or even about her own pride standing in a courtroom full of doubtful faces. It was about a promise made decades ago between two honest men, a promise that deserved to be honored simply because it was true, regardless of who remained willing to stand up and say so out loud. Eleanor listened quietly, then reached over and took her daughter's hand, telling her softly that Thomas would have recognized that same stubborn sense of right and wrong in her without any surprise at all. The next morning, against Walter's better judgment, Ruby asked him to help her find where Amos and his family had gone. Not to pressure the old man into testifying against his will, but simply to see with her own eyes that they were safe and unharmed. Walter argued gently against it at first, worried what it might look like if anyone connected to Dalton noticed her involved any further, but eventually relented, understanding that Ruby needed this more for her own conscience than for any strategic advantage in court. They found the family 2 counties over, staying quietly with distant relatives in a small farmhouse tucked well away from any road Dalton's men were likely to travel. Amos answered the door himself, older and more tired-looking than Ruby remembered from just weeks before, his eyes widening with a mixture of relief and fresh fear when he recognized her standing on the porch. Ruby did not ask him to testify. She told him plainly, standing there in the cold afternoon air, that she understood completely why he had chosen to protect his family above everything else, and that she carried no anger or disappointment toward him whatsoever for making that choice. She simply wanted to see for herself that his granddaughter was healthy again, and that the fear pressed onto his family had not cost them anything worse than a temporary frightened retreat from home. Amos studied her for a long moment, something shifting quietly behind his tired eyes, though he said nothing further beyond a soft, grateful thank you as she turned to leave. The ride home stretched long and cold, the sky darkening well before Ruby and Walter finally reached Millbrook again, neither of them speaking much along the way, both privately aware of exactly what tomorrow would likely bring. Ruby climbed into bed that night with her father's single fragile page resting on the table beside her, no living witness left to confirm its truth, and the very real possibility settling heavily over her that she would walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning, with nothing left standing beside her at all. The morning of the final hearing arrived cold and clear, and by the time Ruby and her mother reached the Millbrook courthouse, the building was already fuller than either of them had ever seen it. Word having spread through town overnight that the widow's daughter would be walking into court with no witness left to support her father's claim. Whispers followed Ruby down the aisle as she took her seat, some sympathetic, most simply curious, all of them carrying the particular weight of a town that expected to watch something painful happen in public. Elias Whitfield greeted her with a small, polite nod as she passed, his expression carrying none of the sharp amusement from weeks before, replaced instead by something almost gentle, the quiet condescension of a man who no longer felt the need to fight hard for a victory he considered already settled. Jacob Dalton sat beside him, looking relaxed and unbothered, occasionally exchanging quiet words with men seated near the front, comfortable in a way that suggested he too had heard about Amos Fry's disappearance and understood exactly what it meant for the case ahead. Judge Marsh called the hearing to order with his usual brisk formality, and Ruby rose when her turn came, laying her father's single handwritten page carefully on the table before the bench, describing as plainly and steadily as she could the original agreement it recorded, the exact bend in the creek, the names of the men who had shaken hands over it decades earlier. She kept her voice level even as she felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing against her, drawing on the countless nights of practice with Walter to keep her words clear and her hands steady at her sides. Whitfield rose almost immediately once she finished, his tone courteous but firm, arguing that a single unverified document, written by a man no longer living, could not reasonably be treated as reliable evidence without some independent witness to confirm its accuracy. Judge Marsh listened carefully, nodding slowly at several points, and Ruby watched with a sinking heart as his expression began shifting visibly toward agreement. His fingers tapping once against the bench in the particular way she had already learned meant a decision was quietly forming in his mind. It was in that exact moment, with the ruling seeming close to settled, that the heavy courtroom doors creaked open at the back of the room, drawing every head around at once. Amos Fry walked slowly up the center aisle, older and more tired-looking than Ruby remembered, his hat clutched tightly in both hands, but his back straight and his eyes steady in a way that suggested a decision had already been made somewhere deep inside him before he ever crossed the threshold. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd as he approached the front of the courtroom, and Judge Marsh, visibly surprised, asked plainly who he was and what business brought him forward at such a late stage in the proceedings. Amos answered simply that he was there to tell the truth about a boundary marker he remembered clearly from decades ago, and that his granddaughter's health had finally recovered enough that fear no longer held the same power over him it once had. Under careful, patient questioning, Amos described the original agreement in full, the flat gray stone marking the spot along the creek, the two landowners shaking hands over it in good faith, details matching precisely what Thomas Hayes had recorded in his own handwriting years before. When Whitfield, growing visibly uneasy, pressed him about why he had disappeared so suddenly just days before he was originally scheduled to testify, Amos did not flinch or soften his answer for anyone's comfort. He explained plainly that two men working for Jacob Dalton had visited his home late one night, speaking politely enough on the surface, but making clear through careful, deliberate words exactly what kind of hardship his family could expect if he chose to speak the truth in court. The courtroom did not erupt into dramatic gasps, but something far heavier settled over the room instead, a quiet, uncomfortable stirring as neighbors who had known Jacob Dalton for years began quietly reconsidering everything they thought they understood about the man sitting confidently at the defense table only minutes before. Dalton's composure finally cracked under the weight of dozens of eyes turning slowly toward him, his jaw tightening as murmurs grew louder around the room, and Whitfield, sensing the case slipping entirely out of his hands, found himself with nothing left solid enough to stand on. Judge Marsh allowed the room several long moments to settle before speaking again, his voice carrying a gravity Ruby had not heard from him since the very first day she had stood before his bench. He ruled firmly and clearly in favor of the Hayes family, restoring the original boundary exactly as Amos Fry had described it, and confirming their rightful access to the water that had sustained their land for generations. Then, after a brief pause that seemed to stretch longer than it truly was, Judge Marsh looked directly at Ruby, his expression softened by something that looked remarkably close to genuine respect, and announced, exactly as he had promised weeks before, his resignation from the bench effective that very day. He did not deliver the announcement with bitterness or wounded pride, but instead with the quiet dignity of a man humbled enough by what he had witnessed to admit it openly in front of the entire town. Before stepping down from his position, Judge Marsh addressed the courtroom one final time, stating plainly that in all his years presiding over this bench, he had rarely seen anyone, of any age, conduct themselves with the same integrity, patience, and quiet courage Ruby Hayes had shown throughout this entire case. He recommended publicly, and with evident sincerity, that Ruby be permitted to formally read law under a licensed mentor, a rare and meaningful opportunity that few young women in that era were ever offered. acknowledging aloud that she had earned it far more honestly than many grown men who had stood before him over the years. The courtroom, moments earlier tense and uncertain, slowly filled instead with quiet, genuine applause, the kind that comes not from spectacle, but from an entire town recognizing something true and rare when it finally stands plainly in front of them. Weeks later, life at the Hayes Ranch had settled back into something resembling peace, the creek running freely once more past land that rightfully belonged to them, water catching the late afternoon light exactly the way it always had before Jacob Dalton ever thought to claim otherwise. Eleanor sat on the porch most evenings now, mending resting forgotten in her lap more often than not, simply watching her daughter with a quiet, overwhelming pride that needed no words to express itself fully. Inside the house, Ruby sat once more at her father's old desk, the same desk she had once played beneath as a small child, gently closing the worn Dalton file that had defined so much of the past several months of her life. Beside it she placed a new file, blank and waiting, its pages empty in a way that felt less frightening now, and more like quiet possibility, the beginning of a future she intended to build carefully, one honest case at a time, just as her father once had before her. If Ruby's courage tonight reminded you that ordinary people are sometimes capable of extraordinary things when everything worth protecting is finally on the line, stay with us and subscribe, because there will always be more stories like hers waiting here, quiet, true, and worth every minute you spend listening.